Welcome back to the final panel of our Japan in 2018 event today. We're going to look at the international realm. There's always a little bit of overlap between domestic and international, as is the case these days. But we'll go to about 3:30, and we have a great chance to talk about a lot of different issues. When we tackled this topic last year, of course, we looked at it through the lens of a new administration coming in, a lot of uncertainty about how the foreign policy pledges during the campaign would translate into policy and who would take over various positions. I think in many ways, a lot of that potential anxiety and uncertainty has been addressed or answered to some extent. I think there's a little bit more predictability or understanding of where the Trump administration is going. But the world itself is, I would argue to some extent, seemingly more dangerous in 2018. That sense of unsettlement or uncertainty continues to persist, and alarmingly so in the North Korean context in particular. Even as we look at record-breaking accomplishments for the Dow Industrials and stock markets around the world, and China's economy now just plugging in year on year above last year's growth rate. First time that's happened for several years. So an interesting dichotomy that we're looking at. And this was a topic that was brought up in the first domestic panel, this idea that from a Japanese point of view, external risk is as much, if not more, of the concern or the focus, or the key variable, rather than on the domestic side. In the U.S. Japan alliance or relationship itself, and we tend to lump a lot of the U.S. Japan dynamics into the international panel, I'd argue a little bit more continuity than change than perhaps we thought from this time last year, but not without their own variables going forward. And some were brought up in the first panel regarding trade, but also in other areas as well. So we have three very experienced and capable guests, panelists to help us here, and I again want to express my appreciation. Their contributions really are what make this all very possible. Julie Chung is going to start us off today. She is the director of the Office of Japanese Affairs at the State Department, and she's been there now for 5 months or so, so a good realm, but it's great to have her here at Carnegie. She joined the State Department in 1996, has served throughout Asia, including Tokyo, Guangzhou, Bangkok, and most recently as DCM in our embassy in Cambodia. She's also worked on the Korea desk here in Washington, among other positions, so a great guest to help us on this front. Taisuke Mibai, on the far left here, is visiting senior fellow at the with the Asia Security Initiative of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. He's a career Japanese diplomat with extensive experience on Korea issues in particular, where he covered those issues while minister in Japan's embassy in Beijing before coming to D.C. just a few months ago as well. And in Tokyo, he also worked on Korea issues from the regional perspective, but also from the nonproliferation side of things. And you served in Washington in 2006? 2009, so it's great to have you back in Washington. And then on my right, we have Eric Sayers, is a new adjunct fellow in Asian security at CSIS, who just recently returned to Washington from a stint in Hawaii at Pacific Command, where he was a consultant to PACOM. And I feel like we've grabbed you now in your first inaugural trip back. You said you were still rummaging through suitcases to try to find a tie to wear today instead of an Aloha shirt. Prior to his time out in PACOM, he was a professional staff member on the Senate Armed Services Committee. He'll also be starting a new job here in town as Vice President of Beacon Global Strategies, in addition to his work at CSIS. So congratulations on that front. So, right. Oh, it's wonderful here. You'll love it. So let me start with Julie. Everyone's going to start off with some opening comments, and then we'll work through some of the themes of foreign policy challenges facing the U.S. and Japan in 2018. And Julie, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Jim. And I know earlier you said we were going to be making predictions today at this conference, but as a government official, I will not be making any predictions. I can highlight some of the issues that are for you in the coming year that we should pay attention to, but no predictions from me. There's no doubt here our ironclad alliance between the United States and Japan is stronger than ever for the peace and security of the Asia-Pacific region. This is apparent from the top down. President Trump and Prime Minister Abe has a very close relationship. They communicate repeatedly, continuously by phone and through meetings. There's no doubt that the priorities that we place in the relationship are really coming from the top down. And just going back to last year, the Prime Minister and President met at a 3-day summit in February, again in July at the G20 summit, and President Trump's first historic trip to Asia. Tokyo was the first stop, and that was very significant. Vice President Pence also had 2 sessions of the U.S.-Japan Economic Dialogue, and as Vice President, he's returning to Tokyo for the second time in just a few weeks, so we're very busy preparing for his visit out to Tokyo. Secretary Tillerson, Secretary Mattis, we've had 2+2 meetings on the defense and state sides, and of course, beyond the bilateral, we've had multilateral engagements that's something to watch in the next year, whether it's trilaterally with South Korea, with Australia, with India, the rebirth of the Quad. And so all these bilateral and multilateral engagements will continue to strengthen and expand in the coming year. So I just want to briefly touch on our Indo-Pacific shared interest, and then touch on security and economics. So first of all, in Indo-Pacific, President Trump said in his national security strategy last month, the U.S.'s strength is magnified by those who share our principles. And I can't think of a better country than Japan, where our alliance and partnership really outlines and shows our shared values and security concerns. So in the 2018, a major area for enhancing U.S.-Japan cooperation will be in the Indo-Pacific region. Also, during President Trump's visit to Asia in November, he outlined his vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific. Now, there's some of the main principles of this are sovereignty, dignity of every individual, rule of law, open markets, free, fair, and reciprocal trade frameworks, freedom of navigation, and private sector-led economic growth. Again, all of these are areas where Japan shares our values and similar vision. And of course, Prime Minister Abe has his own free and open Indo-Pacific strategy as well. But those are very closely melded in terms of our shared interests. And in the context of Indo-Pacific, we look to ASEAN, our Southeast Asian partners, to really be partners in this as well. They have continuously expressed their desire to maintain a rules-based order. And in my 3 tours abroad in Southeast Asia, they have approached us on this rules-based priority. And so as we pursue development and growth goals in ASEAN and Southeast Asia, ASEAN's participation and input would be very, very important, as well as connectivity. I mean, we talk about quality infrastructure, responsible and sustainable financing practices in support of that. So again, the multilateral frameworks you'll see more and more of, again, involving India, Australia, Republic of Korea, and ASEAN and APEC as well. In terms of our security, of course, our most pressing security challenge is DPRK's nuclear and ballistic missile programs. Just a few days ago in Vancouver, we had a meeting with 20 foreign ministers, and we had excellent discussions between Foreign Minister Kono and Secretary Tillerson, bilaterally as well as trilaterally with Korea. And it was really an opportunity to once again reaffirm the maximum pressure campaign. And I would say we are lockstep in our approach and in our positions that North Korea must change its course. And we're committed to doing that both bilaterally, multilaterally, and trilaterally. Now, I know there are historical legacy issues that affect the Korea-Japan relationship. We are keenly aware of that, and we have urged both Korea and Japan to look to a forward-looking way to build mutual trust and reconciliation in terms of that issue, and build an area of healing. So when we also talk about defense and security, President Trump also emphasized during his trip to Tokyo that we would support Japan's readiness and effectiveness amidst the regional security makeup. And that means qualitatively and quantitatively enhancing the defense capabilities. And Prime Minister Abe pledged to buying more advanced defensive weapon systems, which we readily support. So these challenges go beyond North Korea, of course, when we look at security challenges in the coming year. The rise of a more assertive China, which continues to challenge the rules-based order, a more assertive Russia, which appears to seek a veto on political, economic, and strategic decisions of countries around its periphery, and threats in new domains such as cyberspace. So you'll see in 2018 more joint training, exercises, maritime security capacity building, defense equipment, technology transfers for maritime security, defense institution building, and humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, all in support of the Security Alliance. Touching on the trade and investment, this is an area where we've got a lot of work ahead in the new year. Following the momentum of the U.S. Japan economic dialogue, we addressed three key areas: trade and investment rules, economic and structural policies, and sectoral cooperation. The president has made it very clear we do want a fair, free, and reciprocal trading relationship with Japan. The goods deficit is now up to $70 billion. So we have to address that, and this is obviously a key priority for the administration. We did recognize that Japan's investment into the United States is increasing, and we certainly welcome that. We have over 24 manufacturing plants and 43 R&D facilities, and Japanese firms across all sectors employ more than 850,000 people. And that's all great news, but there's room for more, and we certainly look to more investment and more jobs. And we were very pleased last week to hear about Toyota and Mazda's $1.6 billion joint venture in Huntsville, Alabama. Again, looking not towards just R&D and manufacturing facilities, but we're working on workforce development, utilizing tools and resources from Japanese firms to help American workers have the tools and resources to develop their workforce capacity. So finally, on the economic side and back to the Indo-Pacific strategy and our priorities there, we will be looking to do joint adventures, joint cooperation in third countries. And that's something that Max Horry mentioned earlier as well. In November, OPIC and JPIC signed an MOU, the first time we had a framework MOU to offer high-quality infrastructure investments in emerging markets. And so we'll be looking towards capacity building, identifying opportunities to build capacity and rules that help emerging countries make well-informed decisions regarding infrastructure goals, but also promoting commercial collaboration, doing a matchmaking of sorts between Japanese and American companies, doing joint trade fairs, investment missions, and looking towards the areas where we have common interests in the Pacific region. So I would say in the coming year, a lot more multilateral work, a lot more focus on the Indo-Pacific region, working on third country infrastructure with Japan. And I'm very optimistic. And just a few weeks ago, we had a great event at the Sasakawa Foundation with the Trilateral Symposium of Youth from Japan, Korea, and the United States. And those kinds of activities and programs where you bring together the people-to-people ties, especially the young people, it did give me hope in terms of moving forward, and those students will in the future become our policymakers and our leaders. So from the State Department's view, we are very much looking forward to forging stronger and broader relationships with Japan in many areas in the coming year.
Thank you very much, Julie. I had a chance to speak to that group too, and I too came away very encouraged from that dialogue that they had. So I have a tough job today because I have two kind of current government officials and one person here who's just recently worked at Pacific Command. So I promise not to get too tough on them or put them on the spot too much. But quickly, Julie, I just wanted to ask you a question based on your comments before I turn to Mibai-san. In your comments, you really emphasized the mini and multilateral forums and initiatives and the third country collaboration. But we do have a president who at the UN and in other speeches has really emphasized the America First concept and bilateral deals instead of multilateral deals. From your perspective, how do you balance this? Is it a form of networked bilateralism, or are they not as contradictory as they seem from the outside?
Actually, I think it's complementary. The president does talk about bilateral deals in terms of trade deals. But in terms of looking towards our friends and allies and building alliances and shared common interests and goals, it goes much more beyond the bilateral framework. So again, I mean, that's one example is the Vancouver event recently. We do have these discussions on facing North Korea's threats together bilaterally across many countries across the world. But it takes all countries to really participate and put the pressure on. And I think nobody thinks the United States can do this alone. So I think the more collaboration we have in the security and other fields, the more that does fit into the president's America First priority.
Thank you. Ibai-san, let me ask you to offer some opening comments, given your experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it is a great honor to be here at this seminar organized by the Japan American Society and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Actually, for me, this is a debut as a panelist at this kind of event. So I'm a little bit scared facing this much big audiences. Let me first say that I'm originally from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as Jim introduced me, and now hold the diplomatic status with the Embassy of Japan in Washington. But what I speak today does not represent the idea or position of the government or the Embassy of Japan by any means, although I would have a little bit more flexibility than the jury. So today, based on the guidance given in advance by Jim, I first would like to present my thought on Japan's regional foreign policy priorities in 2018. Here I will talk about the Indo-Pacific Strategy, Korean Peninsula, and others. Maybe everybody is aware that Japan has come up with a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy and is now seriously promoting it. As far as I know, this is a concept originated from Japan and shared by the United States, which itself is very much amazing. And I think the objectives of this strategy can be interpreted in three domains: value, economy, and security. As for value, the strategy aims at a rule-based international order, in particular maritime order. This is a part where collaboration with like-minded countries, of course, including the United States, is particularly expected. Regarding economy, improving connectivity within the sub-regions and throughout the Indo-Pacific region will be pursued through infrastructure development, as well as investment treaties and business environment improvement. Maybe the joint venture with the United States will be included in it. As for security, the focus will be on capacity building and enhancement in such areas as maritime law enforcement, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, anti-piracy, counterterrorism, and non-proliferation. People always talk about the relationship between the Indo-Pacific Strategy and China, or China's Belt and Road Initiative. The government of Japan says this strategy does not target any specific country, and this point cannot be stressed anymore. At the same time, I do not think this means that this strategy has nothing to do with China. It has something to do with China, or even much to do with China, which is one of the major factors that were considered in elaborating this strategy. When it comes to how this strategy is related to China, I think the basic idea is to deal with China by relativizing China, by not making China everything. This is not to counter, not to confront, not to contain, not to compete with China, but to set a higher ground of rule-based, free and open regional and even global order, which may group and shape China, not by begging China to join, but by letting China choose if it joins or not. Countries in the region, in particular those in Southeast Asia, are quite concerned about the situation where they have to choose between China on one side and Japan, the US, or others on the other. Japan is keenly aware of this point and very careful in crafting and presenting a strategy not to impress that this strategy is something to force them to make a choice. Actually, therefore, the best assurance in this regard is a good Japan-China bilateral relations. I assume in 2018, Japan will try to proceed with improvement and development of bilateral relations in tandem with the promotion of Indo-Pacific Strategy as its important component. However, it is still uncertain what China's foreign policy after its 19th Party Congress would be. Although China positively responds to Japan's messages for improvement of the bilateral relations, but as you are aware, recently, there are even some moves which could be seen as to test Japan by China. Meanwhile, I assume some points that should be addressed in pursuing this Indo-Pacific strategy. Here, I just touch upon just one thing among them, which is how to materialize the strategy so that it appears to the countries in the region, in particular developing ones in South Asia, and East Africa. Every time, the question about this sort of a concept is, then what's good for us? And Japan needs to come up with specific answers to this question, but cannot finance everything in this regard. While demonstrating its initiative, therefore, Japan needs to get international consent about and cooperation toward this concept, particularly from advanced or like-minded nations. As for North Korea, I sense the Abe administration pursues its policy towards North Korea based on three propositions. First, North Korea comes to a desirable direction with positive actions only when they feel massive pressure, including a possibility of military options, and international cooperation is indispensable for the maximum pressure in this regard. Second, the country which has the most substantive leverage to press North Korea is China. And we need to demand and encourage China to use this leverage by various means. Third, the U.S. commitment to its allies, including the maintenance and enhancement of extended deterrence, is critical. From the beginning of this year, we are seeing some development in the inter-Korean relations. But I think North Korea's positive posture, recent positive posture, is tactical, not strategic. And they will launch a variety of games, a part of which we are already seeing. Even though we can open and end the Pyeongchang Olympic game safe and sound, which I hope further hurdles are waiting, such as North Korea's possible demand for assistance or resumption of inter-Korean projects, as well as the suspension of U.S. ROK joint military exercise. We need to carefully watch how and if they address these items in the months to come. At the same time, I think dialogues and exchanges are multifunctional. Even though they do not quickly lead to denuclearization, they could be used to manage the situation, to reduce tension, to convey direct messages, and so on. So I do not think we have to be too much worried just because the South and the North have dialogues and exchanges. What we need to do is to clearly share, first, what goals we are trying to achieve through these dialogues and exchanges. Second, what tools we can use to achieve these goals. And third, what is our bottom line? In other words, what we should not do among the ROK, US, and Japan. As for bilateral relationship between Japan and South Korea from the beginning of this year, it is awkward or very bad because of the reason everybody knows. To deal with various challenges, including North Korea, managing bilateral difficulties is critical for both countries. And I think the 2015 agreement was risky but a significant decision from this perspective for Japan as well. I sense the way Moon Jae-in administration addressed the agreement this time has created a serious doubt among people in Tokyo about if Mr. Moon is on the same page in this regard. I believe Russia should also be an important component of Japan's regional foreign policy priorities, but let me just slightly touch upon it by saying Japan would pursue its bilateral relations with Russia while striking a balance with international cooperation to check Russia's performance in the other part of the world. Lastly, let me stress that Japan-US relationship is the foundation for every point I have raised today and is an infrastructure of Japan's diplomacy. Based on the good ties between the leaders, the government of Japan will try to enhance the relationship at various levels. In 2018, I expect to see more working level, substantive and intensive talks on the various areas such as Indo-Pacific, nuclear posture, including an extended deterrence, cybersecurity, etc., rather than some kind of telegenic summit meetings. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mibai-san. Let me ask you, too, a quick follow-up question, because, first of all, that was terrific, kind of covering all those different areas. That was exactly what I was hoping for. You talked about an effort by Japan to improve Japan-China relations coming in 2018, but also this key policy goal and view, which I agree with you, vis-a-vis North Korea, which is an emphasis on pressure, that North Korea is not going to change its approach without extensive pressure, and that the key to that pressure is China. Do you sense an element of trade-off in this regard, that Tokyo might be forced to kind of consider, do we get better relations with China, or do we keep up the pressure and get some kind of deliverable on pressure, or are they, again, are they kind of not necessarily mutually exclusive in that regard?
Yeah, first of all, I do not think that they are mutually exclusive. And when it comes to how to deal with North Korea, and for China, the problem is not North Korea, but the United States. So nowadays, North Korea is a very, very important component for China of their bilateral relationship with the United States. So they need to serious about North Korea, including adding massive pressure on North Korea, because United States is serious about that. Mr. Trump is serious about that. So fortunately, unfortunately, I do not think that at this in this regard, Japan can make a significant difference in talking with China. But of course, maybe Mr. Abe or other Japanese officials can assure, in talking to China that it is not our hope that military options will be taken against North Korea, and that's why we need a massive pressure against North Korea, so that North Korea can come to the desirable direction as quickly as possible.
Great. Well, Eric, let me turn to you. We've reached you now before the glow has worn off from Hawaii, before we've recaptured you here into the Beltway and Washington cynicism. So we'd love to hear your view, kind of report from the perspective of your time in PACOM on the coming year.
Yeah, thanks, Jim, and thanks for the invitation, and to the hosts. Yeah, I think I'm in a bit of a difficult spot here. I've been in government for 7 years, much like Julie was doing earlier. I had that internal compass guiding me in what I said publicly, and for the first time in 7 years, I feel the shackles are off, and I can kind of say what I'd like to say. So I turn it to you in the Q&A to test the bounds of that. Just very briefly, as the last panelist of the day, I wanted to tick off a number of those items that I see for 2018. And the first is relationships, and some of those relationships where we'll see continuity and some where we will see change, and those changes will help define the alliance and where the alliance goes. At the very top, and Jim alluded to this, it's clear that the Abe Trump relationship is very strong. And for that reason, this alliance, perhaps unlike some of the other relationships the United States has, especially in Europe with NATO, has been on a very good path, a very opportunistic path, achieving some of those objectives that it would have achieved under any administration over the past year. And I think we can expect that same momentum to continue into this year. Where there are going to be some changes in 2018, I think there's two. The first is evident, and that is that we didn't think it would take a full year, but we finally have confirmed Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asia and Randy Shriver, who is a friend to all of us here and is a friend to the alliance and to the Abe agenda, the alliance agenda. And I think that creates new opportunities as a confirmed Assistant Secretary going forward. One of the changes we're going to see, and that one related to my recent job, is that Admiral Harris will be leaving Pacific Command in a number of months. Given his background and his fondness of the alliance, that will lead to some change, but most especially, I think the Harris relationship with Admiral Kawano, the chief of the Self-Defense Force, was a very strong one the last 3 or 4 years. Many thought Admiral Kawano would leave a number of years ago, but given the trust that Prime Minister Abe had in him and the strong relationship he had with Admiral Harris, we've seen him stay on and be re-upped a number of times. I saw that relationship from up on the hill at Camp Smith, where Admiral Harris and Admiral Kawano spoke monthly by video teleconference, and were really attached to the hip on the core defense issues facing the alliance. And so we'll see both a new PACOM commander and a new chief of the Self-Defense Force, and those personalities and how they get along. We'd be lucky to see if it's anywhere close to the great relationship Harris and Kawano have had in the past 3 years. Over to some of the challenges I think we'll face. It was just discussed a moment ago, but that balance in the alliance between dealing with the pressure campaign and Korea, very much the 10-meter challenge, and then trying to balance the competition that we see that the National Security Strategy said the United States faces with China now and over the long term, a long-term peacetime competition or strategic competition. That will be a challenge in 2018. We will face a number of those, perhaps as an alliance or just as the United States makes its own individual decisions, a constant pressure to balance those two. The irony here is that we have a new national security strategy. We'll have a new national defense strategy this week that places great power competition at the center of U.S. strategy. But the 2018 agenda seems to very much be focusing on rogue regimes in North Korea and kind of the more of a second tier when we talk about great power competition issue. And so how do we effectively carry forward an NSS and an NDS and what is now the National Defense Program Guideline, the NDPG being written in Japan, which will also give priority to China and the alliance giving priority to China over the long term. There's natural tensions there. As well, tensions in the trilateral relationship with Korea. We saw great progress on this trilaterally from a political perspective, but also from a military perspective, where a lot of that opportunity was achieved in the past year, given the Korea threat, the joint threat we faced. If we can make predictions, that's an area where I am concerned we may take a step back, given the politics of the trilateral relationship right now, despite the unifying threat that we see on the peninsula. Great momentum in 2017, almost unexpected momentum in a lot of the different exercises that we did. But we'll have to see in 2018 if we can carry that forward. A number of other pieces, I think, in terms of opportunities. It hasn't been said yet on this panel, but the Indo-Pacific, free and open Indo-Pacific is a nice concept. How we translate that into a strategy and operationalize that is really the question. There is, a big tree, a beautiful tree that we just put up, a month before Christmas, but we haven't yet chosen kind of all the lights and the ornaments and everything we're going to place on that tree and what it's going to look like. There's certainly many continuities in our alliance and things that we're going to already do and already had planned to do, but what can we add to that? What's different about this? How do we carry it forward? The answer to that and the real success, I think, of the administration's strategy in Asia thus far is the resuscitation of the Quad. That's little Q, not big Q. It's not going to be a formal event, a formal conference of states. It's going to be an informal grouping of these four countries that share the same maritime, political, diplomatic outlook of the region. And so for 2018, the open question for me is, is how do we operationalize the Quad? There was a great meeting in Manila in November. There's certainly some opportunities that the United States and Japan and the other two partners have discussed. Of course, this will only move as quickly as the slowest partner wants it to. And we've seen challenges, going back a decade. But there are some great opportunities, I think, to continue these sets of meetings. Just at Resina, a dialogue in India this morning, Admiral Harris and Admiral Kawano and their counterparts from Australia and India did a panel together to talk about where this might head. I think in the near term, another sort of projection for 2018, it's going to be easiest for us not to create any new constructs, but to sort of plug that third or fourth partner into existing exercises like Malabar and RIMPAC and Balakatan, Talisman Saver, of course. I'll just jump ahead as I don't want to take too much time. The final issue, and I'll get to a couple of these other pieces in Q&A. One thing that I think will need an increasing level of attention from a military security perspective, and the State Department's not going to like this, but that's the INF Treaty and how the INF Treaty applies in Asia. This agreement was signed 30 years ago, just last month. It was negotiated by a Republican administration over 6 or 7 years. It was very much with the encouragement or the prodding of the then Japanese Prime Minister in 1986, 87, that it was a global treaty in its scope, and INF ballistic missile ranges were limited not just to the European theater, but globally. So the problem in Europe couldn't just become Asia's problem. But as we see the National Defense Strategy come out tomorrow, the ability of the United States in a sequestered environment, in an environment where the rest are rising just as quickly, to develop and deliver, conventional military fires has become very expensive, whether from a bomber or a submarine or a destroyer, to deliver a Tomahawk missile, for instance, or just hold assets at risk. You have to pay a premium for that. A destroyer costs almost $2 billion and carries 30 Tomahawk weapons. It would be a fraction of that price if those Tomahawks were ashore, but because of the range of the Tomahawk, it can't be ashore because of the INF Treaty. And so Admiral Harris did allude to this publicly in testimony last year, and I think it's going to be an issue that the United States has to look at internally as well as bilaterally within the alliance for how we expect to maintain our military posture and security commitments in the Pacific, not just in the next couple of years that our NDSs and our NDPGs look, but in the next 10 and 20 and 30 years as we face a military geographic problem that just can't be overcome by spending dollars. So I'll leave a couple of those other issues I wanted to address for the Q&A.
That's terrific. Eric, thank you for that. Raised a number of questions in my mind. One quick one I want to follow up with you right now is, I know there's these longer-term issues that you alluded to, but if we just look at the coming year, are there any particular military strategic developments on the horizon in the region that we need to kind of be on the lookout for or be ready to react to as an alliance? I mean, obviously, we have what North Korea did in the past year, from the January 1, 2017 till the end of last year, remarkable improvement in range and testing various missiles, et cetera. We've seen changes in the South China Sea, reclaimed islands by China, and configuration of certain capabilities there. So even though it's not necessarily a calendar year thing, for the sake of a calendar year, are there any particular things that you're worried about or on the lookout for in the coming year that drive requirements or may drive some of our thinking about what we need to be prepared for long term?
Yeah. Two things. I think the first isn't military technical. It's, again, just where I started with personalities. The dual challenge that the U.S. Navy has faced in the past couple of years, both from the Fat Leonard scandals, which knocked off many senior Navy officials that have served in the Pacific in the last decade, and then the very tragic Seventh Fleet mishaps of the two destroyers and the ramifications of that we're still seeing now, have left our potential military leadership in joint jobs like PACOM, but also other senior jobs like Seventh Fleet Commander and Pacific Fleet Commander, have left us with a dearth of leadership, a lack of leadership going forward the next 5, 6, 7 years. Many of those senior echelon people have been kind of wiped out in their careers as a result of these two different issues. And so I worry personally about how we as a military will deal with that challenge going forward, having to rely on other great senior officers who haven't spent the same amount of time in the Pacific theater in the last 5 and 10 years. From a military technical standpoint, I think we're in a very good position vis-a-vis Korea or vis-a-vis China, at least in the near term. That's a testament to good work by DoD and state the last 10, 20 years in investments, not just in the military hardware like missile defense and our alliance's investment in missile defense, but also kind of our foresight for looking at how we're going to posture ourselves in Northeast Asia traditionally, where many of those changes are ongoing. And we haven't mentioned the alliance F word yet, FATENMA, which continues to be and will continue to be a challenge, lingering in the background. That brings to mind one of the things I did want to say, and that we're coming to a point in 2018. Probably, there'll be some ribbons cut, but no one will ever hear about it because it's a good news story, and that's the progress that we've made as an alliance at Iwakuni. Iwakuni as a joint Navy and Marine Corps base where there's a fence line shared with the self-defense force, and there's a commercial airport there with the local prefecture. We've seen for the last 4 or 5 years running almost $1 million a day executed in military construction, where we now have the Marines and the F-35B there, or the Air Wing at Atsugi that's connected to the Ronald Reagan Strike Group. We'll be moving there this year, and there's a good relationship with the local government, and there's a good relationship with the SDF just across the fence line, and that's a good example of where we looked out 20 years ago and kind of saw where we needed to be politically with the alliance, but also strategically in Northeast Asia. If you look at a map, Iwakuni's only a 20-minute jet flight from the Korean Peninsula. It's very far west, out near Hiroshima. And so that's something, again, I guess I give us credit for, and kind of looking out 20 years like we did back in the mid-90s to try to lay some of that groundwork. Despite, FATEMA usually getting the negative press, there's some of those other positive stories.
Very good points to bring up. Thank you. Well, let me ask a couple of general questions here before we turn it over to the audience. I have to start with North Korea, and I want to ask it in kind of an open-ended way. And my question, I guess I'll frame it this way. In 2018, over the course of this coming year, what do you want to see by the end of 2018? What's a reasonable, good news kind of outcome over the coming year? And what do you expect will actually happen in terms of kind of where we'll be or what situation we'll face? Related to that is, by December, will the North-South Korea relationship look similar to the way it looks right now, as very few people would expect or predict, or will it look more like 6 months ago if we took a snapshot in December? I open that up kind of generally in terms of.
Sure. As I said, I'm not going to make predictions, but I think in terms of our objectives and our goals and what we would like to see remains the same, a verifiable and yeah, that's right, completely irreversible denuclearized Korean Peninsula, and that is our ultimate goal. And we've had these recent North-South talks for the safety and security of the Olympics, which we have welcomed. But I think we have to keep the eye on the bigger issue here, which is a denuclearized Korean Peninsula. And I think that's something that the ROK and we and Japan and all our allies recognize. So I think continuing and even expanding the maximum pressure campaign, enforcing the UNSCRs, going to look at maritime interdictions. That's another area that we are looking to other countries to also play a role. I think continuing on that path is really what we would like to see in North Korea make the right choices.
Ibai-san, I have to ask you, because he was quoting the CVID from his six-party days when he was working on that front. So you have a history with this issue.
Yeah. Frankly speaking, I at this juncture cannot be very optimistic about the scenario waiting for us in this year. But any kind of a prediction is meaningful only when it helps us to consider what we do, right? So you can come up with some possible scenarios, including very positive ones and very negative ones. But in any case, we need to seriously consider then what we need to do, then how we need to respond to the situation we can predict. And particularly we need to have very clear images of the situation where we face a dilemma, right? So actually, in the morning session, Ambassador Zuma mentioned about the situation where either Japan or United States comes up with an actually dialogue direction with this is, although the situation is positive, but this is the case where we have to face a dilemma. So, frankly speaking, as long as North Korea is, going towards the negative direction, it is not very much, annoying. It is annoying, but we do not have to face a dilemma. We just, drive things to the tougher direction. And of course, when it comes to whether or not we actually take a military options, this is another dilemma we have to face, and which is we need to seriously, elaborate in advance. But anyway, anything, whatever we predict in the course to come, I believe that this exercise, how we need to respond to, the possible situation. This is a thing we need to thoroughly elaborate in a bilateral or even trilateral talks.
I think at a more general level, it would be a successful year if North Korea does not choose, perhaps by reason of or by way of the pressure campaign, to do an atmospheric test, which would be another big milestone in its step forward in this process. At the same time, I guess my hope is that the United States and Japan, our alliance, doesn't approach the North Korea problem as just a peninsula problem and take a maximalist approach to addressing that core issue. We have to think of this in the context of broader Northeast Asia and our broader strategy in the Pacific as a whole. I worry about the opportunity cost of moving towards a preventive war with North Korea and what that would mean, not just in the costs to the alliance in lives and treasure, but what that would mean in terms of the distraction it would have for us as an alliance from the larger challenge, the larger long-term challenge of the PRC going forward.
Related to this, I can't help but think a little bit about the issue of a potential U.S. military action in North Korea. I think it comes either by one of two reasons, either in response to something that North Korea does, or because there's this theoretical line that we simply cannot tolerate North Korea to go beyond. On that second piece, I don't think, personally speaking, I don't think 2018 is where that line gets crossed, but the debate will sharpen. But in a recent discussion with a Japanese scholar who was visiting Washington, he asked the rhetorical question a little bit. Well, the U.S. and President Trump keeps talking about all options on the table and raising the specter of military pressure in the context of the North Korean issue. And his question to the Americans was, really? Are all options really on the table? And it was an interesting discussion about how much is posturing, how much is real, how much is imminent. And in a way, I wanted to ask the return question, which is, Japan has generally been supportive of it. We haven't gotten into specifics, obviously, but everything I've heard from Japanese friends is that if there was some U.S. action vis-a-vis North Korea, that Japan would be supportive of that Japan would understand and would support it. And my question to them was, really? Would Japan really be happy about that in that context? And I wonder, this is a difficult question for the panel to answer, but in the context of alliance solidarity and, let's say, in a U.S. military action in response to something that North Korea does as a more likely scenario in 2018. What's your estimation of how in sync we are between the United States and Japan in terms of political and public support for an aggressive response vis-a-vis North Korea? I'm not going to start with Julie.
If it is the scenario you're discussing and it is a alliance response or a trilateral response to a DPRK provocation, then that's something I think that we are very much aligned on, given the history, especially the 2010 history with the United States and South Korea. If it is that different scenario that is kind of been on everyone's lips in this discussion of a preventive war or a bloody nose strike, as the term that's been used, that's the kind of thing that more likely comes about in some scenario where there isn't much collaboration or discussion with alliance partners or UN resolutions or things like that. That's a scenario where there probably is less support, especially because that bloody nose or that preventive strike against perhaps ICBM targets that threaten the United States would leave not only the South vulnerable to some type of calculated military response, but would leave Japan susceptible to that as well.
I just say that this is if Japan can support any option, particularly military options, taken by the United States, this is the ultimate political question, right? So I even that Tokyo people in Tokyo have already prepared the answer to that question now. And of course it depends on actual situation, where we are, actually forced to make that decision. So it's a tough, but maybe a very responsible and high-ranking policymakers in Tokyo have already started the mental exercise on Japan, how Japan actually should respond when the United States, Mr. Trump really actually says that this is what I want to do. I want your support.
Something to keep an eye on. We've already seen in 2017 I guess one was still in January, but two trilateral meetings in San Francisco between essentially the National Security Council or National Security Advisors of the U.S. Japan and South Korea. So McMaster, Yachi, and I'm not exactly sure. The South Koreans have been very coy about who has attended on that front, but to me that suggests that at least the channels of communication are quite strong and we're prepared for all situations. But let me begin to involve the audience. We have a lot of people with experience here in the audience, and I'd like to give them a chance to ask some questions. I may jump in again later. And we'll start in the back there, and then we'll work our way back up here.
Thank you. My name is Patrick McGacken with the Wilson Center. My question is for Eric regarding the Quad. I think Mabai-san was right that the intellectual basis of this idea has been floating around in Tokyo for a number of years, but the U.S. endorsed it in a high-level way this fall. And I'm wondering whether or not you think that the Quad is the right grouping of states. In particular, I note that a U.S. treaty ally, it's a liberal democracy with a larger population, economy, and arguably even military potential has been excluded, and that's South Korea. So I wonder if you think it's appropriate in defining U.S. strategy for the region to exclude them.
Thank you. And just for anybody who's not familiar with the Quad, U.S., Japan, Australia, India is generally what that refers to. Eric, I'll give you a chance to respond, but Julie, by all means, because you've been working on this in the context of, you mentioned the OPIC, JBIC agreement. There's some interesting things going on that front.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that's the beauty of the informality of a little Q, small Q quad, where we don't have a secretariat and some sort of conference center in Tokyo or Delhi, where we just get together informally, and that therefore this grouping of states can be defined as 4. It can be defined as 6 if others in Southeast Asia want to take part, the Singaporeans or the Filipinos or the Vietnamese, or even in Europe. If the French or the British or others want to take part as well. I think you can kind of plug and play it, with the concept as it goes along, whether that's in the economic domain and the challenges we face kind of jointly, BRI, or it's in the security domain and it's a Korean Peninsula question, or it's a maritime Indo-Pacific question. And so the extent that we can keep it informal is really to our benefit.
I'll just add, the Quad is not new. Of course, there's been the Quad construct for quite some time. And the main point is to use all the tools in your toolbox, whether it's, again, the Quad or the trilat or the bilats or whatever formulation. Again, the ultimate goal is to get together with our allies and partners who have these shared interests and values in the Pacific and do what we can in the various areas that we had outlined earlier. So again, I think there's a lot of value in Prime Minister Abe's close relationship with Prime Minister Modi. And of course, we already have trilateral talks in terms of U.S., Australia, Japan. So it's again, bringing together whatever elements we have at our disposal to continue to implement the Indo-Pacific programs and policies that we would like to see in the new year.
I had a question here in the green.
Stanley Kober. William Faulkner once famously wrote, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." One of the things that's affecting policy in Asia today, including security policy, is the history issue. We try to cobble together alliances, but we're running into problems, the history, which is now affecting domestic politics. And I would just ask the panel to address that. What do we do if the past is never dead?
Not an easy question to address, but you have some room to play with.
History is very much alive, and it's very much used as a discussion tool for how that affects current policy. Sometimes it's used as a tool of governments to direct a different focus on policy. What's always stuck out for me, though, in that history question is the way that and granted, this is a touchy topic, and I'll be very careful in how I approach it. And of course, the destruction wrought by the Empire of Japan in Northeast Asia was very much different than what happened in Southeast Asia. But where I'm optimistic is the way that Japan has been able to rebuild the relationships it has in Southeast Asia and many of the places that it did occupy during the Second World War. And a lot of the polling data that comes out of those places now, from Singapore to Malaysia to the Philippines to even Taiwan, today the island of Formosa that was occupied during the war as well. And you see upwards of 95% approval rating of Japan. And so very much, it's very much a fact that those countries and their relationship with Japan have been able to kind of escape that challenge of history. Where it still exists, perhaps where it exists and matters the most, of course, is in Northeast Asia. And it comes and goes with the times. We were quite optimistic a couple years ago about this Comfort Women Agreement that was signed just 2 years ago. And now it seems to be very much in limbo as governments have changed in Seoul and where it'll go from there. It's a long, separate panel of itself, but there's places to be optimistic, I'd say, and there's other places that still need work.
I guess I would just add a little bit that to some extent, symbolic efforts or symbolic acts of reconciliation have happened and made some progress. We've seen also symbolic acts of kind of defiance or trying to keep certain memories alive. But I'm thinking a little bit of Obama's visit to Hiroshima, Abe's visit to Pearl Harbor, Abe's speech before the joint meeting of Congress, a variety of anniversaries, and these were all kind of dealt with, and in some ways there was elements of progress, less so on the Japan-Korea front, but you did have the Comfort One agreement. But the substance has not kept up with the symbolism in some ways. And I don't think that the symbolic acts by themselves mean that the history problem is over. There are some in Japan that have argued that the Comfort Women Agreement should be the end of it. Clearly, it's not the end of it if it's still an issue where there are widely different interpretations and memories about what happened and who did what to whom. And so that's not going to be the end of it. But it's also not a situation where simply some new agreement or some new symbolic act is going to fix it either. I think it's a much longer term, much broader based issue. That said, I would like to see Prime Minister Abe go to the Olympics in Korea. I think that would be a great gesture of this idea of at least meeting Moon halfway on the idea of a dual track. We complained when President Park would kind of stop everything because she felt that Korea was not getting satisfied on the history front. But the reality is there's so many other issues that require cooperation and deepening those relationships, as we've seen in the United States with much more investment by Japan and closer personal ties among people of all ages around all over the country, in Midwest and the West and Southeast. To me, it's time and it's deepening relationships like that eventually help overcome these things, but they're no easy.
To not take my own advice and jump off this issue, but just a two-finger on this. There's history in the civic purposes it has for society, and there's history in kind of the political purposes, and unfortunately sometimes nefarious political purposes it can have. I went to China in the fall of 2013 to northeast China, which was long occupied from the early 30s onward by the Japanese. And we went to 4 different cities in Shenyang and Dalian and Dandong. In each city, we were taken by our Chinese hosts to a brand new museum. The paint was just drying, very elaborate, which explained, the Japanese occupation. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, history is important, and local societies need to understand what occurred in those places. But it was very clear that this was less about the past and more about the future, and understanding, and justifying kind of how China views Japan and how China has concerns about Japan. And that was a message. This was a group of congressional staffers, but a message that was portrayed to us for political purposes as a means for explaining why China can never trust Japan, and the Japanese were just on the horizon, and this justified our military buildup, et cetera, et cetera. So for political purposes, and that's very much often how it's used, unfortunately, that's where the challenges lie.
Russ, I need a microphone up here.
Thank you very much. Thanks for an interesting discussion. My question goes to Eric about teasing out a little bit more on INF, the need to revisit INF, painfully arrived at, as you noted, in the Middle Ages. Does that imply that because of the growing vulnerability of U.S. forward-deployed forces, we may need to reconsider or consider deploying intermediate range missiles in the ROK in Japan? Is that what we're talking about here? And the second question, is it true that PACOM may go to the Air Force? And what does that mean?
Oh, there's a prediction for you. Eric, let me turn to you on that, but I may expand the question to my other panelists, because I wanted to look at INF, NPR, and some other things about whether we're having more divergent views between the U.S. and Japan of some defense issues, or more convergent views. I could make an argument kind of either way, and I'm curious what our other panelists think on that front too.
So on INF, this is not something that Asia hands usually think about. It's something that folks who focus on Europe think about, or the non-proliferation kind of crowd in this town in our government. And so it's very much an issue that's just that's been restricted, and it's restricted us from a military perspective, but we haven't had to deal with and think about yet until we've kind of arrived at this situation, the confluence of PLA investments and military investments and our own kind of military budgetary challenges. I think, yes, to answer your question, it is the geographic challenge we face, and the budgetary challenge we face that's driving us to take a second look at this. In the European context and from a UCOM perspective, I get it. You know, it still very much matters, but at the same time, it is a global treaty that was negotiated 30 years ago for a bilateral world. It's out of date. It's not consistent with when it's tying our hands unilaterally in another theater where we face just as much, if not a greater, kind of geopolitical challenge or competition. Where those munitions would be based, if they were ballistic, you know, Japan and Korea are much too close. That's probably the benefit of this. You could base them as far east as Alaska or Guam, or northern Australia, if our Australian friends will let us host them. From a cruise missile perspective, which is a much shorter range, which is kind of on the low end of the INF range, yeah, that would be something that you would want to, if it was mobile, you could deploy across the Japanese archipelago or the Philippines. And that's the beauty of this, is that it's mobile. It doesn't need to be there permanently. It can be rolled out to send the right signal at the right time. It just gives us another way to complicate planning. What was the second? I'm sorry, I didn't write it down.
I was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's you sit outside Admiral Harris's office, as I did the last year, and there are photos of every commander since 1947, and all of them are Navy, including the chairman of the Armed Services Committee's father in the late 1960s, John McCain Sr. So that has become somewhat of a tradition. There was a circumstance in 2004 where Speedy Martin was nominated and knocked out, but not because I think he had the wrong uniform on, more it was related to the Boeing tanker issues of the day. There are a number of qualified Air Force candidates, including General O'Shaughnessy from PACAF, just as there's a number of qualified Navy candidates. And so that questions really rests with Secretary Mattis and the President ultimately.
And then just more broadly on this question, because between now and I mean, it's already the alliance conversation on Japan's national defense program guidelines has already started, but it will really be reaching a fever pitch as we head toward December and the midterm defense plan in Japan to decide its next kind of shopping list for defense items. Do we see, in some ways, these issues of where the U.S. is going on nuclear posture, on maybe some other areas of defense policy, seem to be running in a slightly different direction than Japan's traditional views, but on many other areas I've been seeing almost more convergent defense views. How do you see the alliance defense debate going?
I think there's really no debate in terms of the government to government, in terms of deterrence and defensive capabilities. I think we are at lockstep with the government of Japan. The bigger question is for the Prime Minister and the public, of Japanese public. I think there is ongoing debate within the Japanese system and society about constitutional reform, revision, and those issues. And that's something that I think Japan internally has to really decide and determine to move forward. But in terms of our defense posture and our alliance support, that has not changed, and we are fully supportive of Japan.
So for years, Japanese side has been very keen to engage with a very serious topic, bilateral cooperation arrangement, how to deal with particularly the nuclear. And traditionally, the U.S. focused on mostly with regards to China. Even when I was stationed in Washington, 10 years ago, particularly when we saw the launch of the Obama administration, my colleagues at the University of Japan was very much serious to work on how to engage the next U.S. administration to discussion. And so now we have further equipped as China and North Korean situation. So maybe it's time for us to come into that dialogue over this new nuclear situation, where we both China and North Korea or countries, in a way that is not interpreted as recognition of North Korea as a nuclear weapon state.
Well, it's certainly going to drive a lot of tough questions coming up this year. As the United States and Japan take measures to strengthen deterrence and really deal with North Korea's rising capability, we've already seen Russia complain about some missile defense investments by Japan, and I'm sure China will have their complaints. So it's going to take a lot of tough diplomacy to help smooth out some of these rough edges of the emerging security dilemma. We have time for another question or two. I have one right
here. I'm curious as to what you panelists seem to mean by maximum pressure on North Korea. You already have Russia and China supplying oil covertly. You're going to cut off Jimmy Choo's shoes or something to them to really bring them to the table? I don't understand what that term actually means.
Okay, and let me collect the other question too together.
Also about the North Korean issues, I think there are some opinions that the unexpected passion of North Korea into this Olympics, the participation of them, is actually to conceal their nuclear development or to continue on their nuclear development. So do you think this is a possible scenario? And if this becomes real, do you have any ex post facto measures for this one?
I'm sorry, can you just clarify that the Olympic detente or negotiation is just to protect the nuclear?
The unexpected passion of North Korea into this Olympics, it might be based on their kind of belief that they want to conceal their nuclear development or to continue on the development under the Olympic situation.
Okay, thank you. So in a way, we have a couple of related questions, because this question about what constitutes maximum pressure, and then to some extent, I think you're asking to what extent is North Korea using North-South relations and the Olympic moment as a way to deflect maximum pressure, such as it is. So let me ask our panel. Mibai-san, let me start.
My personal interpretation of the maximum pressure mentioned by Mr. Abe or any other officials in Japan is that it includes both the substantive material, how can I say, the shortage of the things that North Korea needs, particularly the oil, is the thing we want to see. So, for months, or Japanese government insisted that that should be a part of the sanctions against North Korea. And the latest United Nations Security Council resolution was one of the achievements in this regard. And the other thing, but not such a material or substantive, not only such a substantive, stuff, but also the kind of isolation North Korea, needs to fear, as long as they pursue the nuclear development, they are, isolating themselves, in this international community, and this is what we want North Korea to fear. And it is right that when it comes to the Olympic game, North Korea is now, I don't know if we can call it charm offensive, but they show a kind of a positive gesture. And frankly speaking, this is not necessarily compatible with the notion to isolate North Korea as much as possible. But while looking at, as I discussed, what is a bottom line. We need a very careful and a thorough consultation, among the three countries, Japan, US, and ROK, on how we can make use of this opportunity to guide North Korea to a desirable direction, and at least we should not, so that we do not give them what we should not. Thank you.
The Olympics, we are in supporting ROK having a successful and safe Olympics. So I think to that degree, we had welcomed that North-South discussion on the Olympics. But I think we are very clear-eyed, again, on North Korea's intentions and actions, and they have not been a credible negotiator. They have not been credibly explaining why they're taking the decisions to starve its people while continuing its nuclear and ballistic missile program. So I think those are completely separate, and we are maintaining that pressure campaign. Now, turning to the pressure campaign, I think in the past, when we talked about North Korea and pressuring North Korea, it was really relegated to the Korean Peninsula and nearby countries. What the maximum pressure campaign did in the past year is to really expand that globally. We went to countries in South America and Africa, and to use every range of possibility and factors and ways to pressure North Korea, whether it's to cutting off economic ties, removing their ambassadors, reducing their embassy size, whatever it could, again, to put that pressure on. So it's an all-out campaign, again, not going just beyond ROK and Japan, but seeking countries and partners across the globe to do this with us.
Eric, do you have anything? Nothing to add. No. Okay. Yeah, no, I mean, I think on this pressure campaign issue, it's the one area of Trump administration foreign policy that I actually think has been well thought through and pretty well executed. Just a couple days ago, as a result of the September UN Security Council resolution, essentially North Korean joint ventures or businesses abroad are illegal in the eyes of the United Nations, or at least the UN has signed up to shut them down. We'll still see. That doesn't mean there's 100% compliance, and there's reports of North Korean restaurants and businesses in China, for example, that have simply switched names or menus to get around this. But foreign laborers will begin coming home. North Korean laborers will begin coming home from other countries. All of this may not change Kim Jong-un's behavior, frankly. I'm skeptical on that front. So I think we're in for a long haul, but it will weaken the regime and limit its sense of confidence, I think, in the context of creating trouble, either in the nonproliferation realm or in some kind of provocation. I mean, this all remains to be seen, but the expansion of economic pressure seems to me preferable than trying to go to the military route. And for a long time, I had a chart in one of my talks where if pain is the up axis and benefit to North Korea of its testing is the lower axis, I think North Korea has been gaining benefit without crossing a real threshold of pain over the course of how sanctions have been imposed over the years. The goal is to try to push that arrow up above that threshold, and a lot of complicated moving parts to make that happen, and in the process, a lot of questions about whether North Korea has already gained the benefit that it needs, or whether it begins to bargain with some of that capability vis-a-vis further economic pressure. So I think this is going to be one of the dominant foreign policy issues for the challenges for the United States and Japan going forward. China's role is particularly important, as is Russia's, which is all part of this mosaic of regional foreign policy. And we haven't talked as much about Southeast Asia today, although that's a critical part of the mix as well.
On this, and somewhat related to INF, Republicans were very critical of arms control agreements in the Cold War and the détente period, but ultimately it was Republicans who pursued the the zero option in Europe, and as you said, very carefully over 6 or 7 years pursued the ultimate and successful outcome of the INF negotiations and INF treaty. The interesting thing as kind of a third-party observer now will be Republicans who've been very critical of the Iran agreement, which was naturally an imperfect agreement, are now in a position to pursue this pressure campaign, whose ultimate objective is, or the only culmination of it, short of pursuing the other track of a preventive war, is to also negotiate what will naturally be an imperfect agreement with another rogue regime, and that will be a challenge for this administration. And they'll have to find the right figure. Maybe that person doesn't exist yet. Someone they'll empower who can be that Richard Nixon and negotiate with China. Who can pursue that imperfect agreement if this diplomatic track is ultimately going to be successful. And that's what I'll, as a third-party observer, would be interested to watch the next couple of years.
Well, we're glad to have you as a third-party observer back in Washington here. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've run out of time, and I just want to take this quick moment to thank again our supporters and collaborators, Japan America Society, for really bringing this to us and making it possible with the Keizai Koho Center, with NAJAS. And I want to thank Mitsui and Company and Tsurugi-san for coming all this way and for their contributions, and to my panelists for helping us explore these issues. We hope you enjoyed today's event, and please thank you for joining us, and please join me in thanking our panel today.